A very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers, and welcome to Let's Talk. We are delighted that you have chosen to join us today as we continue our discussion on religious liberty. We have had 2 weeks of very meaningful discussion looking at various aspects of religious liberty, and today is going to be a very exciting discussion. We have 2 special guests with us, but before I introduce our guests, I want to let you know that for the last 2 weeks and next week, likewise, we have and will be next week discussing various aspects of religious liberty. Religious liberty is a very broad area, and we do realize that there are lots of misunderstanding. Today, we're going to be talking about tolerance, gay marriages, and government mandates as it relates to religious liberty. Very interesting discussion. We have 2 special guests with us, but before we go into that, we want to invite you, our friends, to bow with us as we have a word of prayer, shall we? Eternal Father and our God, be with us as we share with our friends in radio lands, those who are listening via Second Advent Radio, and those who are viewing on our YouTube channels, SLC Adventist and SLC Church channel. We pray your blessings and grant, Father, that the information today will prove meaningful in various ways. Take full control and have your own way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Friends, again, good afternoon, and we are delighted that you have joined us. We want you to share the link, tell somebody that Let's Talk is on, and we hope by the grace of God to have a very meaningful discussion today. I want to introduce, we have 2 special guests, 2 attorneys at law with us this afternoon. First, we have attorney Leslyn Charles. Okay, I thought I said attorney Charles. What did I do there? Let's see where we are. Just 1 second. Okay, it appears that I am not seeing Attorney Charles. Let me introduce the other guests, and then I will come back to Attorney Charles. She seemed to have been bumped off for a little bit. We have with us Attorney Michelle Slack. We are delighted to have Attorney Slack with us this afternoon. Attorney Slack, welcome to Let's Talk. Let me just say that Attorney Slack is a Nevisian by birth. Nevis is one of the territories in the South Leeward Conference, a territory that I pastored some years ago, and I was thinking last night how long ago I was in Nevis as a pastor, and it's a long time. It's over 20 years, perhaps 24 or so years ago. Attorney Slack is Nevisian by birth. She joined the Seventh Adventist Church as a child around age 9 or 10, and has progressed through the Adventure, the Pathfinder program. She has served the church in Sabbath School, in Personal Ministries, in Pathfinder, Education Secretary as Religious Liberty Leader. She's on the board of the South Leeward Conference's Media Ministries. She is a former state scholar for the St. Kitts Nevis administration, and in 2021, she received the Chevron Scholar Award. She currently holds a Bachelor of Laws degree with first-class honors from the University of the West Indies, and has completed a Master of Laws degree at the University of London. She is by profession an attorney at law, having been called to the bar in St. Kitts and Nevis in 2015, and has been active in practice since then. I am delighted to have Michelle with us this afternoon. Michelle Slack, Attorney Slack, Sister Slack, welcome to Let's Talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Greene. I am happy to be back to participate in this program and to have this discussion on something as topical as what we will discuss today, which I hope will be of benefit to your listeners, as well as to those of us on the platform as well. Thank you.
You're most welcome. And I did say that, I did not say, but this is not Attorney Slack's first encounter on Let's Talk. Our next guest, this I believe is her first time in Let's Talk. So I want to especially welcome Attorney Leslyn Charles. Attorney Charles has been a Seventh Adventist Christian, she says, all her life. She has served the church in various departments. I was privileged to see her church building. She is the head elder of the Pineal Seventh Adventist Church for the last 16 years. She has served on the executive committee of the Greene Conference for 20 years, still serving there. She's an attorney at law for 21 years. She has a private practice. She's married. She has one daughter and one granddaughter. So she has been around. She loves the outdoors and loves serving people. We are delighted to have Attorney Charles with us. Attorney Charles is also the president of the Caribbean Religious Liberty Association. We are delighted to have you with us this afternoon, Attorney Charles. Welcome to Let's Talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greene. It's such a delight to be here to join Attorney Slack, and these topics that we will be dealing with are so relevant to the times in which we live. And I trust that we'll be able to share our knowledge with those on the platform and those looking on YouTube. Thank you so much.
You are most welcome. I am looking forward to a very meaningful discussion with us today. As we go into this discussion, we are, of course, exploring a topic that is deep, is wide. We will do our best to do justice to it. But let's begin this way. When we think of religious liberty, we sometimes think of church services and worship or issues related to the same. We have, however, seen that religious liberty also deals with matters of conscience. In fact, in our first week, 2 weeks ago, when we looked at the definition of religious liberty, we made reference to the fact that it has to do with the free exercise of your conscience regarding who or what you think to be your God, your religion, etc. And we pointed out that that is a God-given right. Now, in this regard, it impacts lifestyles and behaviors because your belief system will relate to your lifestyle, your behavior. Now, a significant aspect of religious liberty also deals with the matter of attitude that is expressed to those who choose a different path. And sometimes, because we're talking about tolerance this afternoon, sometimes this becomes a real challenge. You know, by nature, we always tend to think that our behavior patterns are the correct one and others do things differently. So when people choose a different path, it challenges us. This is really, as I said before, a matter of tolerance. My first question, therefore, is how should we relate to those who choose a different path? How should we relate to other religious faiths, such as the Rastafarians, the Muslims, and such like? Attorney Charles, do you want to take this one first?
Yes. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, as we all know, stands for religious freedom for everyone, every single person, as well as we go to the scriptures often. We say scripture teaches that God gave life and he also gave freedom. We know that from the beginning of time, Adam and Eve, we talk about freedom of choice. Now, whenever people believe differently to us, because we have this perception that we are the remnant church, we're not as tolerant as we should be. And once somebody thinks in a different way than we think, then we find ourselves having conflict and finding it different to accept what others believe. So my first point would be that Adventists should cooperate insofar as proclaiming the gospel and meeting human needs go. And so, in other words, although we do that, we should not entangle ourselves with others. What do I mean? Or we should not compromise the relationship that we have with God. We should therefore go in the direction of trying to reach people where they are. For instance, in the Seventh-day Adventist Church these days, we find we're focusing a lot on mission. especially for Muslims, East Indian evangelism. That's because we realize that we have put ourselves on such a different level than others that we find it difficult to interact with them and to reach them where they are. So we need to relate well with others. So for instance, we support Rastafarians and any other group in their quest for religious freedom, but we do not put our own freedom at risk. We don't give up ours. So we respect one's religious right, but it doesn't mean that we have to accept it. So as Seventh-day Adventists, I would urge that we maintain our policies because they're justifiable and they're biblically sound. We continue to believe that there is a place in our society for everyone, but we should not lower our standards to accommodate others. And once it does not conflict with what we believe, we should reach out to them in love so that they could be drawn to what we believe because of how we treat them.
Now you have said quite a bit there, Attorney Charles, and very interesting. I hear you saying that it is important for us to, and I'm putting it in my own words, to be tolerant of other religious persuasions.
Yeah.
Now, I heard you say that we should seek to make a place for everyone. And that is an important observation. I don't necessarily have to agree with you to respect you. That's a good point. I do believe that some of our viewers may be challenged by this because some people may think that, well, if I don't believe what you teach, then why should I do it? Or why should I tolerate it? But that's an interesting perspective, and I'm sure that somebody may pick that up and ask a question a little later on. I don't know if Attorney Slack wants to add anything to what Attorney Charles shared earlier.
But just before Attorney Slack jumps in, I also wanted to make the point that we should have more conversations about tolerance rather than make accusations and take a position of indifference towards those who hold different views than ours.
Okay, very well. Attorney Slack, you want to add anything?
Yes, just to say that I believe tolerance is a very important starting point when it comes to religion, because most, if not all, religious denominations or faiths believe that the truth they hold is the absolute truth. And if what I hold is that Christianity and what Christianity teaches is the absolute truth, the only way I will be able to engage with somebody from a different denomination is if I am tolerant of their choice and the beliefs that they hold. So tolerance is a very important starting point, and it is very different from having a mind that is so open that you believe and accept everything that is taught by other groups. But tolerance is an important starting point. And along that line is the view that religious liberty does not only mean religious liberty for my religion or denomination. It is religious liberty for all people. So it is religious liberty for the Rastafarians. It is religious liberty for the Muslims as well. And that is an essential element of religious liberty in itself. The only other thing I wanted to add was the critical consideration, which is how would Jesus relate to people of other faiths as well? And from the information we have set out in the Bible, we didn't see Jesus being a person who was dismissive or rude to somebody just because they held a different view. We know Jesus's main characteristic was love. He's a person of love. And in the same way, we ought to reach out to persons or relate to persons from other religious faiths.
Now, it's interesting. You both are sharing some rather very interesting perspectives. If I have the view that I have absolute truth, then I believe you don't have absolute truth if you don't believe like me. But you're saying, notwithstanding that, I have to have the maturity to respect the fact that you see things differently than I do. And respecting you means that I'm not going to hold you as an enemy. That I think is a challenge for some persons. In fact, let me let me ask this question, because we have come to interesting times in the world. We may say that these are changing times. It is especially challenging when individuals who adopt lifestyles that are traditionally considered offensive to us cross our path. So let me create a scenario here. And Attorney Slack, I'm going to direct this one to you. My next door neighbors are, I'm creating a scenario here, so I'm making this up, right? Let's say my next door neighbors are gay and married. So a gay couple who is my neighbor, how should I relate to them? Should I invite them to church? Now, as a Seventh Adventist, should I reach across the fence and say to my neighbors, good day, I'm inviting you to come to church with me today. And if I do and they come to church, how comfortable would they be in a Seventh Adventist church?
I considered comfort as you began asking the question, because this is a matter of evangelism and how do I reach somebody? The first thing I would encourage you to do in that scenario is to get to know your neighbor. At times, we are quick to begin evangelism by presenting a sermon. And sometimes a sermon is not necessarily the first step. So while the end goal may be to get your neighbors to be comfortable enough to come to church with you, as a first step, I wouldn't advise that. Clearly, they're living a lifestyle that is contrary to the lifestyle that a Christian would hold and would teach. The starting point would have to be establishing a relationship with them, which will lead to the ability to have a conversation. And that opens the door for discussion without being seen as trying to convert them into a Christian. Because clearly, if you are over aggressive in your approach to evangelism, it can be taken as a turnoff. So I would not outrightly invite my gay married neighbors to church as a first step. It would be uncomfortable for them, and it may just close the door to what could have been an experience or encounter that would have led to conversion down the road.
It appears to me as though Attorney Charles wants to come in here, but let me put this in first. Even before we talk about the inviting to church part of it, if a gay couple is neighbor to a Seventh-day Adventist, now I have heard some perspectives expressed by individuals, well, maybe I shouldn't even say Seventh Adventists, but by some Christians regarding gay and lesbian couples. How I wonder, would they relate to having a neighbor who is of that persuasion? And Attorney Slack said that, we should first engage them, become friends with them. So let's talk about this acceptance element here. You having a good relationship with your friend, with your neighbor, with somebody who obviously has a different perspective than you. It looks like Attorney Charles has been bumped off again. So Attorney Slack, is to you again. The matter of being a friend to my neighbor who holds very clear different views. So here's Attorney Charles again. This can be a challenge for some people, because some Seventh Adventists listening to us right now may think, I must be friends with them. So I remember, Attorney Charles, we had a religious liberty convention, I believe it was in Guyana, about 3 or 4 years ago. We were talking about tolerance and this whole matter of our prophetic heritage and reaching out to people. So how comfortable should we be engaging, as Attorney Slack said, our neighbors to the point where we can accept them and be their friends?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind is the experience that Jesus had with the woman at the well of Samaria. You see, she had a very bad reputation. I know we're not talking about exactly the same situation, but I think it fits here. And people seeing him might have thought that, it's terrible for him to associate with her. But he reached her right where she was, attended to her need at the time. And so he was able to connect. So sometimes rushing people into church, like Attorney Slack said, might not be the best thing, but you try to connect with them, find some common ground to connect with them before trying to take them into church, because we know how Seventh-day Adventists could be very critical. Because if we want them to identify with a different community besides their gay community, then we have to have an alternative for them. So we help them to feel safe at first, help them to feel comfortable with you before taking them into your congregation where there might be a number of persons who might be uncomfortable. Because healing, spiritually or otherwise, takes time. So you would have to learn how to connect what their needs are and then work from there onward before taking them into church. That would be my take.
Okay, interesting perspective. So we should let them, and I sometimes say that we are the face of the church, really.
Yeah.
The impression that my neighbor gets of me as an individual is really the impression they're getting of the church. So I am representing the church to my neighbor. And so therefore my neighbor should know that as an individual who obviously has a different perspective and outlook on life than they do, that I still value them as individuals. Sometimes you hear people calling for demonstrations and to be violent against individuals who have a different perspective. We don't necessarily, I shouldn't even say necessarily, we don't need to go there because we have the element of choice. If I understand choice correctly, if I give you the opportunity to choose, I must not be upset with you when you exercise that choice, correct?
And
right. Yes.
just to add as well, we are coming from a place where our society is now evolving, and certain things that were previously taboo are now becoming acceptable. So the Christian neighbor has to show love, because in years past, or maybe decades past, a homosexual couple may have been stoned or abused. And a Christian, a person who calls himself or herself a Christian, ought not to engage in that behavior. You may have that level of anger towards the sin that is being committed, but condemning the sin is not supposed to spill over into how you treat the individual who is your brother or sister.
And Dr. Greene, I can think of, like, in gathering time when we go around to solicit funds for humanitarian work, some persons don't speak with their neighbors, gay or otherwise, at all during the year. And then when in gathering time comes around, we go and we show a face that they never saw before. I believe it's the same thing. We need to treat those we connect with or live nearby as neighbors, treat them with love all the time, so that when the time comes for us to really reach out to them and seek their help, they'll be very willing without question to assist. But we can't not talk to them all year, and then at the gathering time, we're going to tell them something that they never knew all year because we never spoke with them.
That is very true. Now, I just want to go back to this matter of inviting these persons to church. I don't know that anybody would argue with the fact that church is supposed to be for everybody. God's concept is that it should be a house of prayer for all people. My question is, should people run the risk of being made so uncomfortable when they come to church? Should our churches not be places of refuge and shelter, and where an individual can come in and feel comfortable and be ministered to without necessarily being frowned upon?
That's the ideal, but regrettably, we have not gotten to that point as yet. It's going to take a lot more education, and it's going to take a lot of tolerance in order for us to get there. So even though we would want it to be at that point, I am pretty sure we haven't yet gotten there, and it's going to take a while, but we have to keep working at it. So anybody of that, any person like a transgender or a homosexual or any person of that kind comes into church, they might expect some sort of unpleasantness from some of the members at first. So I know that that is practical, but we'll have to keep working on it to see how best we can get around that, because we need to. Church is really a hospital for sinners.
All right, let's move on. Time tends to go quickly. Now, as Christians, we are clear that marriage is between a woman and a man. You know, the Bible makes that point very, very clear. It is also clear that cohabitation without the benefits of marriage is wrong. In other words, if I decide that I don't want to get married, but I want to live with my girlfriend or my boyfriend, I'm cohabitating. That the Bible also says is wrong. Is it discrimination when we are willing to reach out to a man and a woman living together without the benefits of marriage, and not reach out to a homosexual couple? So I know that this couple is homosexual. I'm not going to visit them. I'm not going to invite them to church. But this other person, they're living together. They're not married. I'm going to invite them to church. What's the difference here? And why is this so? Now I'm asking for your opinion. I know that, but is it discrimination? Which of you wants to respond to that?
I don't mind beginning. I'm not sure if I would, to an extent, it is discrimination, but
Yes.
I would prefer to look at it as evidence of our own prejudice rather than to outrightly describe it as discrimination, which can take on a different connotation. We tend to categorize sin, and we may view the sin, what is considered to be the sin of homosexuality, different from the sin of cohabitation without the intention to get married. And one may be more acceptable in our society than the other. And so we may be more willing to reach out to the unmarried cohabitating couple than we would be to reach out to the homosexual couple. It is just, in my view, evidence of our prejudice and how we have categorized certain sins. But in fairness as well, in our Caribbean societies, cohabitation developed and cohabitation has grown to where common law unions are acceptable, and even legal in some of our jurisdictions. Homosexuality is otherwise. That was taboo. We're coming from a place where it was punishable by death at one point. The sin of the offense of sodomy was punishable by death. And so that is where we are coming from. And as the society evolves, our attitudes to behaviors would evolve as well. And I think this is what may lead to somebody like me being more willing to reach out to a cohabitating unmarried couple more readily than I would reach out to a homosexual couple.
You know, I'm wondering if the fear is that if I witness to a cohabitating couple, it is very easy for them to change their status relatively. You know, they decide to accept Jesus, they can get married. If I witness to a homosexual couple that is married, and they wish to accept Jesus, then I have to say to them, you're going to have to change your status. And I'm wondering if perhaps that might be a factor. Attorney Charles, you are an elder. You have been heading up your church there for a while. So I am tempted to ask you this question. Is the sin of, I see you smiling, is the sin of cohabitation, sex without marriage, without the benefits of marriage between a man and a woman, they're living together, is that a different category of sin to a homosexual couple who are engaged? Okay, it looks like Attorney Charles has frozen. on us there. So Attorney Slack, you did indicate that there seems to be, at least in the minds of some, a distinction. Shouldn't we as Christians take the Bible and not the standards of society as our guide?
Definitely. For us, the Bible does not make a distinction between sin, and we say repeatedly, all sin is sin. And as a matter of fact, what we're discussing here are both in the Bible discussed as sins against the body. And the Bible speaks forcefully about these sins. I don't believe we should categorize them if we profess to be following what the Bible teaches. However, in our interactions and in our daily life, we are naturally influenced by what happens around us. And so it may be easier for us to gravitate to do a particular thing as opposed to doing something else, which may be a little bit more difficult for us to venture out and do.
Okay, very well. Attorney, you
before is that God does not approve of either the couple living together without being married and the homosexual couple. Notwithstanding the fact that it might be easier to get the male and the female, the traditional couple, to get married and to stay in the church. It might be a harder thing to get the homosexual couple into church, but both of them are wrong. And so we would have to find ways of reaching both couples. And I believe as Seventh-day Adventists, like you rightly said, we will tend to reach out to the traditional couple faster than we would want to reach out to the homosexual couple.
Interesting. Now, there's a question that I want to respond to at this time, and somebody is asking. We have a few questions. It appears that one of the chats is not working. I'm getting some indications from one or two of our viewers that one of the chat is not working. If any of my technicians are available, please check that out. Some folks are indicating that they're not able to ask questions in the chat. But here is a question, at least on one of the chat that came through. And this person seemed to be asking, so is it that we should accept them as they are? Now, we made reference to inviting this homosexual couple to church. So is it that we should accept them as they are? That's a question. In other words, are we suggesting that we should really accept them? Let me read this other question before you respond, because I think it is kind of in line with that question. Can I really preach against gay marriages and still be tolerant of those who choose to do so? What is the difference between tolerance and acceptance? And here is the question that the person posed. Let me just pull it up here. The person is asking, how do we deal with, how do we differentiate between tolerance and acceptance? In other words, how can I show tolerance to someone who is gay while at the same time showing that I do not accept their lifestyle? So that is why I said that it appears to me as though this question is pretty much like the other question. I would like you both to respond to this. Is there a difference between tolerance and acceptance? Can I preach against something and still accept it?
I would, acceptance extends beyond tolerance, I would say. You cannot accept something without tolerating it first, but you can tolerate something without accepting it. And I would want to repeat that. I'm saying you cannot accept something without tolerating it, but you can tolerate something without accepting it. So to me, the main difference between tolerance and acceptance is that acceptance indicates a greater sense of reception and freedom for others to be themselves. But for tolerance, you wouldn't change your standard. You might be able to tolerate the person or what they're doing, but you're not going to change your standard or what you believe in to accept, go further step to accept what you believe is wrong.
So if I ask, therefore, when I made reference to, maybe I want to use a different word here, respecting an individual's right of choice. If you choose a path that is different from my path, I may be convinced that that is the wrong path, but I should respect your choice and not make you an enemy. That's what I'm getting at here. Yeah. So I want our viewers to understand that what we are saying is that the fact that somebody, and given that we're talking about homosexual here, a homosexual couple who choose to get married, then we're saying we do not condone marriages in that way. But at the same time, we do not try to kill the individuals. We should not. Are we together on that, panelists?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, as Christians, we are speaking specifically about homosexuality, as opposed to any other sin. But it would be the same thing with any other sin. People are still to be treated with dignity and respect. We are all sinners. And if I am going to treat Attorney Charles as inferior or less than or not human because she chooses to lie, that is contrary to what I profess that I am as a Christian. In the same way, I ought not to treat a homosexual person in my neighborhood as nothing because he's made a choice that I don't agree with. And clearly there's a distinction between tolerance and acceptance. I may not accept that behavior, but in order to have a conversation with somebody, in order to shed some light on what I believe with somebody, I would have to tolerate their choice. I have to tolerate their choice that I don't agree with. So it starts with tolerance. There's a big difference between the two. I need not accept it, because if we accept, as Christians, we cannot accept homosexuality because it is outside of what the Bible teaches. But in order to win souls for Christ, there must be a level of tolerance.
Tolerance, right.
Okay,
And
so if I get you both correctly, you're saying, therefore, that when the homosexual couple comes to church, I do not turn them out of the church. I tolerate them. I let them feel welcome like any other visitor should feel welcome. And I should have the opportunity to minister to them in a way that would make them want to return. Am I reading you correctly?
Yes. Very
okay,
correctly.
so that is what should happen in an ideal situation.
Ideal.
They should not. Now, of course, if they come and the Sabbath school lesson is on homosexuality, then they may have a difference of opinion. But I would dare say that even so, when we teach, we never know who we have in our congregation. We don't want to embarrass people, but we can share with people the love of God and share the biblical principles. We can be very clear and very firm on the biblical principles, while at the same time respecting people's choice to choose differently. Now it gets even more interesting, and I'm seeing a question here, but I want to preface that by asking, I want to go to government mandates and trends, because, as we approach the end of time, we will see a deterioration in standards and principles. We are people who believe, based on the prophetic outlook of the Bible, that things are going to get worse morally. We live in a society that is becoming increasingly pluralistic, and gender fluidity and alternative lifestyles are the current trends, and governments the world over are becoming more and more accepting of constitutional changes that give rights to persons who were once marginalized. I think it was Attorney Slack who mentioned that once upon a time, in many of the jurisdictions in the Eastern Caribbean, that certain things were criminal offenses in terms of homosexual practice and lifestyle. So if, for example, let me back up a little bit. When a government legalizes things like abortion and gay marriages, and I'm putting abortion here because we're not dealing exclusively with homosexuality here. We're looking at government mandates in general. But when a government legalizes things like abortion and gay marriages, now I suppose that there are implications for the Christian. If, for example, there is a mandate that anyone who seeks an abortion, let's say within the first 6 weeks, is free to do so at any public medical institution. And I am a Christian physician. I'm working at a medical institution, a public medical institution, and somebody comes and requests an abortion. It may be against the principles that I hold. How do I, as a physician, relate to that when there's a government mandate that says, listen, anybody who requests an abortion within the first 6 weeks is duty bound to get one? How should I relate to a situation like that?
I believe it's important that the healthcare professionals who find themselves in that position, let's say Seventh-day Adventist healthcare professionals, they should have the liberty to practice medicine despite the government mandate, because that is a constitutional provision for freedom of conscience out of their deep conviction. So these are the same convictions that would likely motivate individuals to choose to commit their life's work to care for other people. So simply because a patient decides that they want a particular medical procedure, let's say an abortion, it does not in and of itself compel action on the part of that particular health.
Okay, it looks like we have a break in transmission there from Attorney Charles. In the meantime, Attorney Slack, do you want to jump in and?
Sure. I agree with the way Attorney Charles was going. And actually, I believe this question is one that is very relevant. And I say that because in St. Kitts and Nevis, it was this year where certain, we had decisions from our courts which now make certain provisions dealing with homosexuality unconstitutional. So we are heading in that direction, and abortion, homosexuality, these things, as time progresses, we will see becoming more and more acceptable in society. On the specific question of the Christian physician, though, that I believe would be a matter for that physician's own personal perspective within the context of her employment relationship. That physician would have been employed before the mandate took effect. One, as an employer, the employee would be responsible to seek accommodation, which the employers should offer. And I say accommodation meaning the physician ought not to be forced to have to perform an abortion, provided that it is contrary to what that person holds as their belief, because that is also protected under the Constitution. So it would have to be a discussion within the realm of the physician's employment relationship with the employer, as well as the fact that this is a public medical institution, and the physician may choose or opt, if there can be no agreement reached in relation to the physician's job description, whether she would remain at that place of employment or not. But as I said before, the physician ought not to be forced to perform a procedure that runs contrary to what that person holds as a religious belief.
So that the freedom of conscience that Attorney Charles made reference to earlier, now that should apply also to my own freedom to practice my religion, even in a secular setting. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Okay, interesting. That's comforting, because I do sometimes wonder when we have these ethical dilemmas out there, when these mandates are being made, how do we relate to them? So that's comforting to hear. Now, there is a question here that I want to jump back to before we move on. And the person is asking an interesting question. If um if that homosexual couple who comes to church requests to be baptized, because now they come to church and they study the Bible and they understand that they need to give their lives to God, what is the next step? I think the question did ask, what is the next step? What do we say to them? How do you deal with the conversion of a gay couple who is legally married? How can they join our church? Can they join the church? Now, of course, as a pastor, I want to be quick to point out that, but I'm going to ask you a question from a legal perspective, attorneys, but I just from the theological side of it, from the ecclesiastical side of it. When an individual is ready to surrender to Jesus Christ, my responsibility is to ensure that they understand what they're saying yes to. And if it is that they're doing something in their life that is contradictory to the principles of the Bible, then I should point that out to them. I am not going to baptize a couple who is cohabitating without the benefit of marriage and don't wish to change it. And so in a similar way, if there is a couple who is married, 2 males, 2 females, and they want to serve God, I'll have to let them know that this is against the biblical mandates. But my question is to you now, when it becomes a legal thing for couples, same-sex couples to get married, and they come to the church and say, I want to be a member of the church is there to serve. Anybody who wants to come to Jesus must come to Jesus. And I deny them the right of baptism on the basis of the fact that they're not following the biblical mandate. Can they sue the church for discrimination?
It depends on they can sue, because if the law allows them to be married, and we'll have to examine all the legal rights and principles under the legislation. In Guyana, they don't have the right to marry. Gay couples don't have the right to marry. So that would be a no-no here. But it depends on the territory. I've seen people, I've heard of stories and read articles where people have said it's discrimination to not have them be a part of a church or an activity. Or if, let's say, someone is a baker and doesn't want to bake for a gay couple and things like that, they can sue. It's the level of success that they will get is another story. But they're free to think about it as discrimination if the law so provides and supports what they're being prevented from doing.
Over the last few weeks, while I have been discussing these matters of religious liberty, and we make reference to the Constitution every now and then, I have been forced to wonder, because, once upon a time, there was in the Constitution something that says this is wrong, and then there's a constitutional amendment, and in this day and age, Attorney Charles, you mentioned, for example, just now that in Guyana, homosexual couples cannot marry, but you are aware that the trend that is happening these days is that more and more jurisdictions are changing those constitutional provisions.
Yeah.
So what may not be today may be tomorrow.
Maybe tomorrow.
And I'm wondering, is it possible that the Constitution can contradict itself? Is that a dilemma that is possible? For example, as a church, I have the right to religion, to practice and teach my religion. That's a constitutional provision. So if somebody is going to sue the church because the Constitution says this is legal and you have the right to do it, wouldn't that be a conflict?
I find that for every freedom, there are, even though it's constitutionally, it's a constitutional provision, more and more we're seeing that there are limitations to those freedoms. So it's no longer that it's absolute, even though the Constitution provides for it. So that sometimes, like if someone brings a challenge in that regard, for the example that you just gave, I'm seeing more and more in the courts that it's looking as if the Constitution is kind of contradicting itself, because we had a cross-dressing case here, and it was thrown out, and long ago men couldn't appear in women's apparel, but since that case they can do whatever they want in terms of dressing. So it would appear as if more and more limitations are being put on those freedoms, and sooner or later we might find ourselves in a constitutional dilemma in that regard.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, Attorney Slot, you're going to say something. Go ahead.
Yes, when Attorney Charles mentioned that homosexual marriages in Guyana is a no-no, the case that she just mentioned came to mind, because I don't think it will be very much longer before it is possible or permissible, because that in that cross-dressing case, what the court found was that if it was previously an offense for a man to dress in woman's apparel and for a woman to dress in men's apparel. And the court found now that that was an infringement on their constitutional right to freedom of expression. And so while the values and norms of society continue to change, and we accept international standards and we sign on to international agreements, these rights that are now being attributed to certain groups are being considered by our courts in determining what is constitutional or not. So I don't believe it would be much longer before we get there. In terms of a suit against the church, if a gay couple is not permitted to become part of the membership, what I would suggest is the Constitution is an agreement between the state and the citizens. And so one of the first things you have to consider is whether the organization that is being accused of violating your constitutional rights is a public body. And as a religious institution, the church has its own rules and procedures. And if it is that a gay couple is not able or cannot comply with the rules and procedures to be admitted into membership of a particular organization that may not be a public body, that is a hurdle they would have to cross in determining whether a suit is viable or whether it is dismissible as being frivolous. And these are the times we're heading in. They would require much more legal consideration, but there would definitely be significant hurdles to cross.
What I'm seeing here, is a sort of framework for things to come, and how challenging it may be for us in terms of maintaining the biblical principles. Because when we look at the way things have changed over the last 25, 30 years, it is rather amazing. Now, someone asked a question that I want to respond to very quickly. You may comment on it if you wish. I think it's very theological. The person is asking, is there a categorization of sin when the Bible calls some sins abomination? And I think that that's a very interesting reference there. The individual, when we spoke earlier about tolerating couples who may come to church, who may have a different view. And the Bible does say certain things, use the term abomination. The concept here, let me just say this in passing, our time is almost up, but the concept here is not that there are big sins and little sins, because all sins will keep you out of heaven if you are not repentant of them. But then some things in their public display are what we call very derogatory. Of course, in a court setting, offenses carry different weights, but wrong is wrong at the end of the day. Now, let me hasten to ask attorneys And Attorney Slack, maybe you can respond to this. I remember that there was once a cruise ship that was reported to be carrying, we're still in the area of tolerance here. This cruise ship was reported to be carrying a large number of gay passengers and it was scheduled to dock in a territory. I'm not going to call the name of the territory where I was working. I lived and served on different islands. So now the call was made by the Christian community on that particular territory, to petition the government to turn them away. From a legal perspective, do we have the right, or is it ethical to demonstrate against the government allowing a cruise ship carrying gay couples to its port? Should a person be denied the right to visit a particular territory because of their belief system or lifestyle? From a legal perspective.
Legally, yes, you have the right to petition against any decision taken by the government or any action about to be taken by the government that you don't agree with, provided that your protest is peaceful. It would be a different consideration if the question is whether as a church we should do that, if we should join in a petition or demonstration to prevent persons from docking in our jurisdiction, because I'm not sure whether the church would want to make a public stance in that way on one singular matter, especially when we are speaking about love and tolerance. And while the government also may prevent a vessel from docking in its shores, because the Constitution allows that as well. Certain restrictions on movement and persons who are non-citizens can be prevented in their freedom of movement in a particular jurisdiction. But that is something the government can do. Whether a Christian would want to say, no, do not allow them to come in, whether a Seventh-day Adventist would want to say, no, I do not want them in this country because they hold a particular lifestyle, is a different consideration, and perhaps something we would not want to be at the forefront of.
I would be a bit challenged. We talk about separation of church and state, and I think we ought to be wary of the government getting involved in making religious pronouncements. Now, it may be in our favor sometimes, but on other times it may be against us. And so I remember, for example, that the Muslims, Attorney Charles, you are from a territory that has different ethnicities and yes, different religious, different religions, let me just put it that way, Muslims, Hindus, etc., Christianity. But they were in the process of building a mosque in Antigua, the Muslims. And I remember getting on my desk a petition from some Christian pastors, not Seventh Adventists, but Christian pastors. And they wanted me to sign a petition to take to the government to block the Muslims from building the mosque because they say that Antigua is a Christian territory. Now, my response was, we as a church teach freedom of religion, and we should not hinder people from practicing their religions based on their conscience. And hence, we were not comfortable taking that move. Now, some Seventh Adventists are challenged by that. But when we talk about separation of, there were two issues that I think we were dealing with. One is asking the government, which is supposed to be separate from church, to intervene and to make pronouncements in church matters. And secondly, the whole matter of freedom of religion. If I want you to give me the freedom to practice my religion, I should, one of these days I may end up in a Muslim territory, and I would want to be able to worship my God in the Christian faith. So I should likewise be, and here we're using the word again, tolerant to those others. I don't know if any of you want to comment on that one, as our time is just about up.
Yes, sometimes we don't get it as Seventh-day Adventists that it's not just about us. We keep harping on the remnant. Religious freedom is about helping others to exercise their freedom too, even though we don't believe what they believe. So if a Muslim in a territory is having a challenge worshiping the way his conscience will permit him to worship, then we should, be tolerant and support in that way, because religious freedom is more than just going into a church building or a mosque or a synagogue or wherever. It's that, well, people should not have to go against the core of their values and beliefs in order to conform to what anybody else believes. So if we want ours upheld, then we should assist, and we should not go against other people when they want, or other religious groups when they want their freedom to worship in the way their conscience dictates to be upheld.
Well, ladies, I have to say that our time is up. And I want to express gratitude to you both for sharing. We have another very interesting discussion lined up for next week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you both. We are going to have to end here. There was, well, let me say there were a few other questions that we wanted to consider, but our time is up and we're going to respect that. So I want to thank you. If you wish to take a few moments to just share briefly, a closing thought perhaps might be in order out of our discussion for today. And we look forward to continuing this very important discussion next week. So Attorney Slack, Attorney Charles, any final word you want to share with those who are viewing, you may do so now.
I would just like to make one statement that says efforts to repress religious freedom is not just an attack on individual liberty and human dignity, but on the very foundation that has made territories around the world strong. That will be my closing.
Thank you so much. That is a whole discussion for next week, but thank you so much. Attorney Slack? Yes,
my encouragement to the listeners would just be to love. And if you start from the point of view of love, you could get a long way. Love covers a multitude of sins. And while we have to be firm in what we believe, we have to be firm to the point that we don't accept and be tossed to and fro with every doctrine, but we still have to be tolerant, and it requires love for us to be able to do that. So I'd encourage everybody to just love as Jesus did.
Thank you so much. Next week, friends, we are going to be continuing, in fact, wrapping up our discussion on religious liberty. We're going to be talking next week about the whole matter of our relationship with other churches, other denominations, and for that matter, other religions. So it promises to be a very interesting discussion. We look forward to having you. May God bless you. Have a wonderful